Welcome back to Forgotten Frontline WW2, the channel where we uncover the hidden stories, forgotten heroes, and overlooked moments that changed the course of the Second World War. If you love learning about the untold brilliance behind the war machines, tactics, and people who shaped history, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Today, we're diving into a story that sounds almost unbelievable. A moment where one civilian's idea, something that experts dismissed as impossible, ended up giving American pilots a decisive edge in the skies of World War II. It's a story of ingenuity, persistence, and how a simple idea made the legendary P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that terrified the Luftwaffe and dominated the Pacific, almost untouchable. Our story begins in 1941, before the U.S. had even entered the war. The P-38 Lightning, designed by Lockheed under the brilliant mind of Clarence Kelly Johnson, was a marvel of engineering, sleek, futuristic, and incredibly fast for its time. Twin engines, a central nacelle, with heavy armament and long-range capabilities made it one of the most advanced fighters in the world. But it also had problems. Pilots loved its power and speed, but the P-38 had a critical flaw, one that nearly doomed it before it ever saw combat. When diving at high speeds, especially past 400 miles per hour, the aircraft would suddenly lock up. The controls would freeze, the nose would tuck down violently, and the pilot could do almost nothing. Some described it as flying into an invisible wall. Others simply called it death in a dive. The cause was compressibility, a phenomenon not fully understood at the time. As the P-38 approached transonic speeds, the airflow over parts of the wing went supersonic, creating shock waves that robbed the control surfaces of effectiveness. The faster it went, the less control the pilot had, until many planes plunged into the ground before recovery was possible. Lockheed engineers were baffled. Even Kelly Johnson, one of the greatest aircraft designers in history, couldn't find a practical fix that didn't require redesigning the entire plane. The Army Air Forces were worried. The P-38 was their main hope for a long-range escort fighter. But if pilots couldn't safely dive or escape combat, the plane would never survive in the brutal skies of Europe. Then, from an unexpected place, came help. In a small machine shop in Burbank, California, a civilian engineer named Charles Hall, known as Chuck to his friends, had been following the development of the P-38 closely. Hall wasn't part of Lockheed's official design team. He wasn't even a military engineer. He worked as an independent consultant, occasionally helping with machining problems or custom tools for aircraft parts. But Hall had something that the experts often overlooked: curiosity and intuition. According to accounts from Lockheed veterans, Hall had overheard pilots discussing the P-38's deadly dive problem one afternoon. They explained how once the dive began, no amount of pulling on the stick could bring the nose up. The plane would shudder, then spiral into the ground. Hall thought about it quietly. He wasn't a physicist, but he understood how air and pressure worked on mechanical systems. That night, he went home and sketched out a crude drawing on his workbench, a small spring-loaded flap that could deploy from under the wing during high-speed dives. The idea was simple. If you added a surface that increased lift on the bottom of the wing just enough, maybe it could counteract the nose-down force that caused the dive lock. When Hall showed the sketch to Lockheed engineers, they laughed. Compressibility was a new and mysterious phenomenon. The idea that a flap could solve it sounded naive. One senior engineer reportedly told him, "Son, if it were that simple, we'd have done it already." But Hall didn't give up. He built a small model and tested it in a homemade wind tunnel. Nothing fancy, just a wooden box, a fan, and some manometer readings. The results surprised him. When he simulated airflow over the wing, the flap changed the pressure distribution dramatically. It didn't eliminate the shock wave, but it seemed to shift the center of pressure enough to restore balance. Hall brought his findings back to Lockheed and begged them to try it on a test aircraft. After weeks of persistence, Kelly Johnson finally agreed to let him fit the flaps on a prototype, partly to prove that it wouldn't work, and partly because he admired the man's determination. The test pilot chosen was Ralph Verdon, a seasoned flyer who had already experienced several close calls in the P-38. On a bright California morning in 1942, he took off with Hall's small dive flaps fitted under the wings. At first, everything felt normal. Then he nosed over into a steep dive from 25,000 feet. As the airspeed passed 400 miles per hour, the familiar vibrations began. Normally, this was the point of no return. But when Verdun deployed the new flaps, the plane steadied. The nose came up smoothly. The P-38 responded as if the invisible hand of death had been lifted. Verdun leveled off. Stunned, it worked. When he landed, Kelly Johnson was waiting. Verdun climbed out of the cockpit, grinning. "Kelly," he said, "that little flap saved my life." From that moment, the P-38's destiny changed. Lockheed refined Hall's design into what became known as the dive recovery flaps. They were installed on production models starting in 1943 and retrofitted on earlier versions as quickly as possible. The effect in combat was dramatic. P-38 pilots in Europe now had a crucial edge. They could dive after German fighters without fear of losing control. They could escape pursuit by plunging into high-speed dives that enemy planes, especially the Bf-109s and FW-190s, dared not follow. In the Pacific, the long-range P-38s suddenly became unstoppable predators. Ace pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles McDonald racked up dozens of kills, often using diving attacks that would have been suicidal before the flaps were added. American engineers would later admit that this small innovation, born from a civilian's impossible idea, saved hundreds of pilots and likely thousands of aircraft. But the story doesn't end there. Hall's contribution almost went unrecognized. Because he wasn't an official Lockheed employee, his name didn't appear on the patent. The dive flap system was formally credited to Lockheed's engineering team, with Kelly Johnson overseeing the final design refinements. Hall continued, working quietly in his shop, proud of what he'd helped achieve, but never seeking fame. It wasn't until years later, when aviation historians interviewed Lockheed veterans, that his story resurfaced. One engineer recalled, "If it hadn't been for that stubborn guy with the little flap, we might have lost the P-38 program." It's worth understanding just how vital the P-38 became to the Allied effort once its dive problem was fixed. In the European theater, it was the only Allied fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into Germany before the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Its twin engines gave it the range and survivability needed for long missions over hostile territory. With the dive flaps installed, it could tangle with the best of the Luftwaffe and come out on top. In the Pacific, the P-38 was unmatched. Japan's Zero fighter was deadly at low speeds, but it couldn't match the lightning in speed, climb, or dive. American pilots quickly developed tactics around this advantage, diving from high altitude, striking fast, and pulling up safely using the flaps. Japanese pilots often tried to follow, only to lose control or tear their planes apart. General George Kenney, commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, called the P-38 the best damn fighter in the Pacific. And much of that praise unknowingly was thanks to one man's persistence. What makes this story so powerful isn't just the technical solution, it's what it represents. During wartime, innovation often comes from the top down. Government contracts, military committees, giant corporations. But sometimes it's the outsider, the tinkerer, the mechanic, the dreamer, who sees the problem differently. Hall didn't have advanced equations or a team of researchers. He had intuition and a refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable, and that mindset saved lives. In later interviews, Kelly Johnson himself acknowledged the importance of contributions from outsiders. He once said, "You never know where the next good idea will come from. Sometimes it's from the man sweeping the floor." That humility, combined with Johnson's brilliance and Hall's determination, made Lockheed one of the most innovative companies in aviation history. The P-38 went on to serve with distinction throughout the war. It escorted bombers over Europe, hunted Japanese fighters across the Pacific, and even played a pivotal role in one of the most dramatic missions of the war. Operation Vengeance. The interception of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. On April 18, 1943, U.S. intelligence intercepted Yamamoto's travel plans. 16 P-38 Lightnings were sent on a daring 1,000-mile mission to ambush his aircraft over Bougainville. Flying at treetop level for hours, they executed one of the U.S. longest and most precise fighter missions of the war, and successfully shot down Yamamoto's plane. The operation was only possible because of the P-38's incredible range, stability, and performance, all of which were enhanced by the dive recovery flaps that made it a true long-range interceptor. After the P-38 Lightning overcame its deadly dive problem, the aircraft quickly evolved from a troubled experiment into one of the most formidable machines of World War II. Yet even with the dive recovery flaps installed and pilots singing its praises, the Lightning's journey was far from over. What came next was a series of missions, battles, and technical breakthroughs that would cement its place in history and reveal how one design could change the entire philosophy of air combat. By 1943, the P-38 had become a familiar sight in both the Pacific and European skies. Its twin engines and distinctive twin-boom tail made it instantly recognizable, even to friend or foe. But what truly set it apart wasn't just its appearance, it was its versatility. The Lightning could climb like a rocket, dive safely now thanks to its flaps, and carry heavy firepower over enormous distances. No other Allied fighter at that point could fly so far, fight so hard, and still bring its pilot home. The American pilots who flew her began to trust the aircraft with their lives. In the Pacific, where distances stretched endlessly over open water, the P-38 was a lifeline. It escorted bombers to Japanese-held islands, hunted enemy ships, and even strafed airfields deep behind enemy lines. For the first time, the U.S. Army Air Forces had a fighter that could reach the Japanese on their own turf. But this new confidence in the plane also pushed pilots and engineers to test its limits even further. The P-38's dive flaps had fixed one deadly flaw, but new challenges soon appeared. At high altitudes, where temperatures dropped to freezing and the air thinned, the P-38's turbochargers sometimes failed. The engines would lose power, forcing pilots to descend quickly or risk being easy targets. And in the bitter cold of Europe, the cockpit heaters often malfunctioned. Pilots joked that flying a P-38 in winter felt like sitting in a refrigerator with wings. Lockheed responded as fast as wartime production allowed. Engineers improved the electrical systems, refined the controls, and upgraded the turbochargers. Every adjustment came from field reports, from pilots who wrote letters, sketches, and even crude diagrams describing what worked and what didn't. These weren't just minor updates. They were examples of how frontline experience shaped design in real time, and how collaboration between mechanics, engineers, and pilots kept the Lightning ahead of its enemies. Among the pilots who mastered this aircraft, one name stood out: Richard Ira Bong. A quiet man from Wisconsin with a boyish grin, Bong became the highest-scoring American ace of the war, with 40 aerial victories to his name. Nearly all achieved in the P-38. His aircraft, nicknamed Marge after his sweetheart, became a legend. Bong's success wasn't just about skill. He knew exactly how to use the P-38's strengths, diving, climbing, and recovering with perfect timing. The same dive recovery flaps that a civilian engineer had once been laughed at for suggesting now allowed Bong to execute maneuvers that enemy pilots couldn't follow. Bong's tactics became the textbook for new pilots arriving in the Pacific. He would attack from above, using the Lightning's superior altitude performance. He'd dive at incredible speed, fire in a burst, and then pull out safely, where others would have once lost control. When Japanese fighters tried to follow, they found themselves outmatched by a plane that could dive faster and climb higher than anything they had. Bong's mastery of these techniques made him the face of American air superiority in the Pacific. Meanwhile, in Europe, the story was more complicated. The P-38 had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany, but cold weather and high-altitude performance still plagued early models. Many pilots initially preferred the new P-51 Mustang, which was faster at altitude and simpler to maintain. Yet the P-38 had unique advantages that no other fighter could match. Its twin engines gave pilots a sense of safety. If one was hit, the other could still bring them home. Countless pilots survived long enough to tell their stories because of that redundancy. In late 1943, American commanders realized something crucial. The P-38 could be more than just a fighter. It could be a precision strike weapon. By equipping it with bombs or rockets, it became a deadly fighter-bomber capable of wiping out bridges, trains, and supply convoys with surgical accuracy. Its heavy nose armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, meant that all fire converged along the center line. Unlike other fighters with wing-mounted guns, the Lightning's weapons didn't need convergence adjustments. Pilots could fire from farther away, hitting targets with devastating accuracy. In the Mediterranean theater, P-38 squadrons were used to hit targets across Italy, southern France, and even deep into the Balkans. They destroyed rail lines, convoys, and coastal defenses that German forces relied on. In North Africa, the Lightning's long range made it ideal for reconnaissance. Its cameras captured vital intelligence that helped plan invasions and bombing campaigns. Pilots often joked that the Lightning could do anything, except make coffee. As the war continued, new variants of the P-38 appeared. Each version fixed a problem or added a new capability. The P-38J and L models, in particular, represented the peak of the design. With improved engines, better radiators, and even stronger dive recovery systems, they became the definitive Lightnings of the war's final years. By 1944, these versions could outrun or outclimb nearly any enemy fighter at medium altitude. But perhaps the most dramatic chapter in the Lightning's story came in April 1943, when it carried out the daring mission to intercept Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. This was more than just a military strike. It was a symbolic act of justice. American codebreakers had intercepted Yamamoto's travel itinerary, revealing that he would be flying between bases in the Solomon Islands. The challenge was that his plane would be hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied airfield. Only the P-38 had the range to reach him. 18 P-38s were chosen for the mission, flying a route so long and precise that even a few minutes of error could mean failure. They flew at treetop level for over 400 miles, staying under Japanese radar. When they reached the rendezvous point, Yamamoto's transport appeared right on schedule. In a brief, violent exchange, the American pilots shot down both his aircraft and his escort. It was one of the most precise and audacious missions of the entire war, and it changed the course of the Pacific conflict. The success of that mission proved what the P-38 was capable of when used to its fullest potential. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a strategic weapon, and it had been saved from early disaster by a small, unassuming piece of metal beneath its wings. Back in California, the man who had first proposed the dive flap, Charles Hall, continued to work quietly. He had been offered a permanent position at Lockheed but declined. He preferred his independence, saying he felt more useful thinking freely than tied to corporate meetings. Still, he followed the war closely, cutting out every newspaper story about the P-38 and marking them with pride. His family would later recall how he kept a small model of the Lightning on his desk until the day he died. It wasn't about fame or recognition for him. It was about seeing something that worked and knowing he'd helped make it possible. After the war, the P-38 continued to serve in many roles. It became a reconnaissance workhorse during the occupation of Japan and even into the early stages of the Cold War. The photo reconnaissance versions, designated F-4 and F-5, were stripped of guns and packed with high-resolution cameras. These aircraft photographed Europe's bomb-scarred cities, recorded the advance of Allied troops, and documented the devastation that had once been hidden behind enemy lines. Historians still rely on those photographs today. When the jet age dawned, the Lightning's reign gradually ended. The new jet fighters, faster, sleeker, and more powerful, made propeller-driven aircraft obsolete almost overnight. Yet pilots who had flown both types often said that nothing ever felt quite like the P-38. Its controls were responsive. Its engines sang in harmony, and its twin tails framed the sky like the wings of a hawk. Even decades later, when restored Lightnings flew in air shows, veterans would look up with tears in their eyes, hearing the same throaty roar that once meant life or death. The P-38's story is also a story about evolution. not just of technology, but of human understanding. During the 1930s and early 1940s, aerodynamics was still a frontier science. Terms like compressibility or transonic flight were mysterious, almost mystical. Engineers were learning by doing, and many lessons came at the cost of pilots' lives. The dive recovery flap wasn't just a clever trick. It was a bridge between old-world flying and the new physics of high-speed flight. It taught engineers that air wasn't simply a smooth, obedient medium. It could behave violently and unpredictably at the edge of the speed of sound. That understanding would later guide the design of jet aircraft, rockets, and even the first supersonic planes. In a sense, the P-38 Lightning was the first American aircraft to dance at the edge of the unknown and survive it. By 1945, as Allied victory drew near, the Lightning's reputation was secure. It had served in every major theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen skies of Europe and the humid jungles of the Pacific. It had carried out long-range reconnaissance, precision bombing, and air-to-air combat with equal success. More than 10,000 P-38s were built, and they accounted for thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed. But behind every statistic was a story, of a pilot who returned home, of a mission that succeeded, or of a design that refused to fail. Even as new aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt stole the spotlight in popular history, the Lightning's contributions remained vital. In many cases, it was the first in and the last out, the plane that carried the fight to the enemy when no one else could. After the war, Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed went on to design some of the most iconic aircraft ever built, including the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird. Both of those designs pushed the limits of speed, altitude, and technology, just as the P-38 had done in its time. And just like before, Johnson kept the same philosophy: simplicity, innovation, and never ignoring a good idea, no matter where it came from. When asked years later what lesson he'd learned from the P-38's dive problem, Johnson said, "Never underestimate the man with a fresh perspective." That statement might as well have been a tribute to Charles Hall. Though his name never appeared in official histories or award lists, his contribution remained one of those quiet victories of human ingenuity, the kind that changes everything without ever being noticed by the world. Today, a handful of P-38s still fly. Each one represents countless hours of restoration and love from enthusiasts determined to keep its legacy alive. When those planes take to the air, slicing through the sky with that unmistakable twin-engine sound, they carry with them not just history, but the spirit of everyone who built, maintained, and flew them. And perhaps, somewhere in that echo, there's still a whisper of the man who thought the impossible could be solved with nothing more than a small flap of metal and a stubborn belief that he was right. The story of the P-38 is not just about an aircraft. It's about vision, courage, and the kind of quiet genius that rarely makes headlines, but forever changes the world. It's about how problems that seem unsolvable can yield to imagination, and how even in times of war, creativity can be as powerful as firepower. For every aircraft that took off safely after that discovery, for every pilot who pulled out of a dive instead of perishing in it, and for every victory that followed, the legacy of one civilian's impossible idea lives on. And perhaps that's the truest measure of innovation. Not medals or recognition, but the lives saved and the possibilities unlocked. Even now, nearly a century later, aviation engineers still look back at the P-38's story for lessons. The principle of the dive recovery flap remains part of the foundation of modern aerodynamics. The same logic that saved the Lightning helps stabilize modern fighter jets and even spacecraft re-entry vehicles. The line between those technologies might seem vast, but it's connected, a straight path that begins in a small California workshop and ends among the stars. Every time a pilot pulls out of a high-speed descent, every time a modern aircraft performs a supersonic dive safely, that same principle is at work. A simple concept. A simple idea. A single act of defiance against the word impossible. And that is how the legacy of the P-38 Lightning and the unknown man who helped perfect it continues to live, not just in museums or history books, but in every piece of flying technology that came after. Because sometimes, The greatest victories aren't won in battle. They're forged in the mind of someone who refuses to accept defeat.